There's nothing like a global epidemic to make the imagination go towards a dystopian future. Dystopian literature is a genre that comes up again and again in world history. It is also there within film and many different mediums. Sometimes we find utopian literature where people depict a perfect world and a perfect society. But in the dystopian literature, the author's imagination tries to show a world that has somehow gone wrong and awry. The two classic examples, at least from early 20th century fiction, were both written by Englishmen, and between the 1930s and the middle 1940s, obviously a time of great turmoil in world history, the time of the two great world wars, where the world was undergoing a massive transformation, politically, but also industrially and economically. Society was changing rapidly. Some people's imagination was stimulated towards thinking that the industrial society will herald in a new era of human prosperity and somehow solve all the issues of human life, like disease and poverty and war. But then other people were a little bit more skeptical, looking at the situation and seeing that the increased industrialization and the changing in global relationships doesn't just bring, not necessarily only bring good things, but will also come at a great cost. And dystopian literature is important because it also warns society. By using your imagination and entering into the possibilities of different futures, you also become a little bit more aware of the issues at hand and what the potential decisions you make now, to what it can go towards. So the two books we're going to take a look at is A Brave New World in 1984, studied all over in many high schools or even in university classes, standard stock literature that one looks at. And the two are interesting because both describe a dystopian future, a world that has gone a little haywire, but they have very different visions, different versions of what this dystopian future would look like. We first take a look at 1984. As the title says, the book apparently plays out in 1984, but we're not sure exactly what time era it is, because it depicts a world that is basically being taken over by a totalitarian state. It was written by George Orwell and published around 1949, so just in the wake of the Second World War. And it has it has this overtones of what would basically happen if communism completely took over the world. And the kind of oppression or totalitarian government that is depicted there is one that is very heavy and that controls people through deprivation, violence, and propaganda. And many of the terms that Orwell uses in this book has become now standard terms. You see, for example, the idea of Big Brother, Big Brother that is watching, the government that is constantly surveilling people, making sure that they all stay in line. We see very ingenious wordplays. For example, there is the Ministry of Truth that is responsible for propaganda, the Ministry of Peace that is responsible for war, and the Ministry of Plenty that is responsible for rationing and for deprivation. So Orwell shows this very twisted kind of political situation whereby lies, by the constant repetition of lies and propaganda, people are kept ignorant and their base emotions are brought to the fore, fear and anger, because it is easier to control people if there is a lot of fear. And the character in Orwell's book also has a very tragic ending, a very tragic story, not one of a successful rebellion, but showing a person that somehow doesn't buy in to what is happening and has this urge to rebel and break free from this horrible society. But at the end, he is defeated by the omnipresent and omnipowerful state that has just so much control over the individual. Now, many people have looked at 1984 and said, well, that is very interesting, but really the dystopian future that we are more likely to face, a greater risk, is that depicted in A Brave New World. A Brave New World, also written by a British author, Aldous Huxley, very famous for Brave New World is probably his most famous book, but also famous for writing the book The Doors of Perception, from where the famous psychedelic rock band got their name from. But Huxley's version of a dystopian future it is a little more complicated. There we are transported to a world in the future, supposedly around the year 2500, and society is very peaceful. It is very stable, and social control has allowed people to flourish in a certain sense. Because the price that they paid for this high level of social stability and peace is also total control by the government. And how the world rulers keep people under control is not by oppression and deprivation, but by constant floods of sensual stimulation and also propaganda in the form of conditioning. So people are not born naturally, they are grown by the government in different hatcheries. And when they are born, they are submitted to intense many years of conditioning, oral conditioning, where certain ideas are pushed into their mind to make them peaceful and docile. And they are discouraged. There is no such thing as the family unit, because the family unit creates division or creates people that have independent interests. So everybody is encouraged to stay dependent on the state. And just free sexual relationships are there. Commitment and trust between people, or commitment between people, is not encouraged. And this way a kind of social control is achieved, but at what cost? Because while people may be free and happy to a certain extent, they also, their higher faculties are not really encouraged. Creativity, spirituality, the idea of anything transcendental or above the temporary is just not at all allowed. And at the moment that the individual shows some inclination for independent thought, they ultimately get exiled. And then that's what happens to the lead character in the story. Because what is interesting that we see in both these books, both these versions of a totalitarian government, it is the spiritual impulse and the strong individual urge of transcendence that has to be crushed. It is that urge of transcendence that causes a lot of difficulty, because it is the natural desire for freedom and for liberation and for the truth that will make people look for something beyond what is just here in the here and now. And what is very relevant then for the spiritualist is to see how the ultimate oppression, it is a fact that we live actually in oppressive reality, and the greatest oppression that is there is the oppression of the temporary that has taken hold of what is eternal. The soul's oppression by matter is the ultimate, that is the real conspiracy that is happening. And the desire for freedom and for liberation is supposed to direct the individual towards looking out for transcendence. And that is also the ultimate propaganda, the propaganda that is being presented not merely by the world, but also just by how the world is presented to the senses, of thinking that the body is the self. And that is the primordial lie that the individual has to somehow shake off in his search for self-realization. So very interesting how these themes of dystopianism and totalitarianism is relevant not just on an individual level, spiritually, but also as society is undergoing radical changes now. And we're all looking to see how this current historical situation, how that will change the way in which society goes. We have now had an era of relative peace and prosperity and a lot of liberty and freedom in the post-World War II era, but also one of great consumerism and great selfishness. And it will be interesting to see now what the result is, and as we enter into a new phase of history, how exactly society will be structured. But for the spiritualist, at least, the opportunity is always there for transcendence, because it's understood that it is by discipline and the independent search for the truth by means of spiritual practices like meditation, contemplation, and reading spiritual literature, that one is able to maintain a sense of freedom and independence regardless of the external circumstances.